morning. Welcome to Mortality with Meep. Today I'm going to just be pulling a couple of results out of this recently released research from the Society of Actuaries, a U.S. population mortality observations preview of 2020 experience. And I have this in a navigation view so that you can see the different sections here. We don't have to look at the table of contents. There's overall population mortality, also looking at what happened with specific age groups, and then also specific causes of death. And before I get into this, the reason you don't see certain slices of how these data are that we can do for, say, the year 2019 is because we don't have that detailed data yet. Usually it takes about a year to get the finalized data, to get it at the level of detail into the wondrous CDC system. So for some of these data, we only have through the second quarter, so the first 6 months of 2020. And of course, the first quarter, which is January, February, March of 2020, there's not so much of a COVID impact. Second quarter is when it really began. And then, as we know, fourth quarter, so the fall and then the winter into 2021 is where we saw our peak COVID deaths in the United States. That said, this is not only looking at COVID. I will be digging into, just as I said, I'll show you a few of the graphs, a few of the tables, and describe what we're looking at. And I'm going to get rid of some of this material so we can just focus on what's in the report. So first, let's start with the overall population and what happened with mortality. In Figure 1 from the report, and I will provide a link directly to the report in the video description, we see the raw death rates, or the crude mortality rates, which is total number of deaths divided by the total population. So we're not adjusting for how ages are changing and that kind of thing in this one. So we can see since 1999, it's been generally coming down, a little bit of a bump up in 2017, etc. But in 2020, of course, we saw a big increase. It was about total 16% increase over 2019. And so that's what we see in this table is the percentage change year over year in just these rates. So a 16% increase, not a number of deaths, but in the rate. Of course, the number of deaths, it's going to be about the same because the population size didn't change that much. But if we remove the official COVID deaths, or I should say the preliminary official COVID deaths, from the total deaths from 2020, we still see that there was a mortality increase from 2019, an increase of 3%. So that's one of the things that they look at in this report. You're going to dig into it. Going to pass over this quarter over quarter figure, but you can take a look at that yourself. And one of the things I want to point out to you, again, these are crude mortality rates. They are not adjusted for the age structure. All of this is very preliminary, and so we're in general using the simplest ratios to look at when we're going, and of course there's going to be loads of mortality studies coming out of 2020 and 2021 experience. We will be adjusting for ages and making those comparisons. We'll see some age group comparisons in a bit. But it's going to take time to get that level of detail and that level of analysis. So we're going to start at the top level. One of the things I want to point out to you before we begin is this huge disparity in mortality rates between men and women. This has been in the developed, in the U.S. for over a century. Basically, since maternal mortality has dropped a lot with improved hygiene at childbirth, and then, of course, with antibiotics for postnatal infections, which was a killer of a lot of mothers. In general, other than maternal mortality, men have died from most causes more often than women. And so we see that in the history, male and female, but also with COVID, the increase for men was 17% of the overall crude mortality rate. compared to women at 14%. Yes, COVID hit men harder than women, but we also see, again, look at this last row, and I'll try to highlight this so you can see this. So first on the left we have women, and on the right we have men. The mortality removing COVID, for women it increased 2.3%, and for men 3.4%. So excess mortality hit men harder. It's not surprising. This has long been a historical situation. So the next figure I want to point out to you is the COVID and non-COVID mortality in year 2020. And we're not doing this against 2019 right now. This is just against reality. So the blue bars are all the non-COVID causes from 2020. And I think a lot of people, and this is really showing it to you, often we don't graph this on the same scale because old age mortality is so much higher and from everything compared to younger ages. But we'll dig into the younger ages in a moment. So we already see the pattern. Infant mortality, and then mortality kind of disappears for young ages, and then increases as you get older, and it increases in a particular Gompertz Macon law. Fits very well to the natural mortality we see increasing from over age 45 in general. And you'll see if you look at the COVID, which is the red, that increase is actually, it's in the same pattern. And I've done some fits. It does fit the Gompertz-Macon law pretty well. And that's because this is kind of a fragility law. In any case, males dying more from COVID than females, that's, that's expected. They generally die from infectious diseases and all sorts of natural causes at a much higher rate than women in general. And that's a fragility. Generally, there's various theories of why males have higher mortality from natural causes. From external causes, we'll see that in a moment. It's true for that as well. In any case, older people were more susceptible to COVID deaths than younger people, and it was in a similar kind of relationship. And you'll note, yes, this is, not half. It's not, it's not a huge percentage, but this is not minuscule. And if you look at the COVID as a percent of the total deaths, yes, it's higher for older ages, but it is actually pretty substantial for some of these younger seniors and then kind of the older middle-aged people. So let's look at that information in another way and start providing the comparison against 2019. What we see in these two columns, the deaths per 100,000, all causes of death and excluding COVID, are the numbers we just saw graphed in that prior figure. And we can see, and this is, all causes of death, and then excluding COVID. You see that for the younger ages, there's almost no COVID mortality. There is some noticeable differences for COVID mortality for older ages. Okay, so if we exclude COVID versus all causes of death, as we saw before from the prior table, from all causes of death, that's about a 16% increase compared to 2019. And if we remove COVID from that mixture, it's 3%. And that's the one I want to look at. We'll look at all causes of death in a moment. But I want to see, okay, what was the mortality like year over year for these different age groups? Where are we seeing excess non-COVID mortality? Not really seeing it. It's actually a wash for the oldest ages, so for 85 plus. It's almost no difference. Barely a difference for 74 to 84. But as we're starting to get into younger adult age groups, and specifically age 15 to age 44, this is substantial increase, okay? If we look at the all causes of death, we are seeing a substantial increase in mortality from 2019 to 2020. It's like over 20%. The highest increase was for age 25 to 44. You don't hear that, do you? And that's because, of course, if we look at the rates for those age groups is still a lot lower than older ages. But from a relative perspective, a lot more young adults died in 2020 than in 2019. But when we look at excluding COVID, almost all of their excess mortality is coming from non-COVID causes. So that's what we'd really want to investigate. Yes, we should take a look, from a COVID perspective, you do want to take a look at how older age groups were affected. And we can see non-COVID excess mortality at single digits. It's still pretty substantial for age 45 to 54. But where is this excess mortality coming from for these younger age groups? And that's where we get into the cause of death analysis. And unfortunately, we don't have that split out of cause of death and age for the full year yet. Still, we do have, at least for age group and quarter, so this is just to let you know, for cause of death, we have a lot of the causes only through the second quarter of 2020 and some through the third quarter of 2020. But let's, just continue to focus on the age groups and specifically the non-COVID mortality. As I said, I've been looking at the COVID mortality and just excess mortality in general over this past year. So let's just focus on the non-COVID aspects. So what we're going to look at, and you'll see there are these, groupings of age groups. And then we have our total death rate and the quarter over quarter change. What I'm wanting to look at are the without COVID columns. And again, if we look for children 1 to 4, it was just going down each quarter. And probably because car accidents are one of the top causes of death for young children, and they're not getting driven anywhere, so they're not in car accidents. Similarly, 5 to 14, there was a little bit of a bump up in Q3, but it may just be noise, so we can ignore that for right now. It's starting with the age 15 to 24 that we're seeing some large increases quarter over quarter. So it even started in Q1. But Q2, we see a bump up of about 5% non-COVID, and then an even bigger bump in Q3. So Q3, remember, is about, it's summer basically. So it's June, wait, I'm trying to remember which ones, right, July, August, and September. And so we saw a big jump up, and I'm thinking that was accidental causes of death. And Q4, it actually continued to rise. So these are things we're really going to want to know more about, especially what's the cause of death. That's 15 to 24. 25 to 34, again, Q2 went up and Q3 went up. So spring and summer, and it continued to go up in Q4. These are really, really bad patterns. 35 to 44 went up a lot in Q2. And continued to grow at that high rate in Q3, and then grew in Q4 not as high. And we're seeing that for 45 to 54 as well, a bump up. And again, remember, this is non-COVID. 3% increase in Q2 compared to Q1, then another 3% increase in Q3 to Q2, and then not as much of an increase in Q4. So we're seeing that in a lot of these, 55 to 64. Now, for older ages, it has a different pattern. But we do want to know about this. Unfortunately, for a lot of the causes that may be driving it, and it may differ, of course, by age group. So they break it up into two big groupings. One is physiological, and so that's kind of the natural causes of death, heart disease, cancer. They have COVID here, so you can see the specific quarters. So this is through 2020 Q3, and we have it for these major natural causes of death. And so you can also see the scale. Heart disease and cancer outstrip the other causes by a huge amount. They are still the reigning top two. Eventually, cancer may go past heart disease as the top cause. We're not quite there yet. And let's take a look at these top causes. And I'm sorry, here's the quarter-over-quarter change. I'm actually not going to talk about that too much other than to point out the specific causes of death. And all I want you to check out is whether it's positive or negative quarter-over-quarter. So you'll see cancer is negative, negative, negative. I'll actually end on that because that's the good news cause of death. Pulmonary is also down, but it's not as high a cause of death as cancer. Stroke went up. Alzheimer's, you're seeing starting in Q2 and Q3, that was going up. Diabetes went up. Flu and pneumonia, you actually have to ignore this to a certain extent because Q1 is always higher than Q4 because it's flu season. So yeah, the quarter over quarter there doesn't tell you much. Maybe a year over year, so same quarter prior year, if we could make that comparison. Kidney disease is flat. Liver went increased, but we're really getting into some low causes of death once we get down here. But this makes me think. So Parkinson's went up. Think of Alzheimer's disease went up Q2, Q3. Same for Parkinson's Q2, Q3, and that's making me think nursing home deaths. Because a lot of these people have to be under nursing care if they died due to Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. And pneumonitis and HIV are pretty low. Pneumonitis was decreasing. Okay. That still could have been some noise, and HIV was flat. But if we look at all of these natural causes of death, as it were, there was increases in Q2 and Q3. So was that directly a cause, like a result of having COVID, or was it that the people weren't being treated, or they weren't going to, the hospital and that kind of thing? I'm not going to do all of the causes that are in this report. I just want to show you, and each line here, so where you see it 1999, 2000, that's full year, but it's also end of year. So when we see 2020 here, we'll see 3 dots. That's 2020 first, second, and third quarter. And roughly that's winter, spring, and summer. So we don't have the fall result, and we don't have that increase in the fall for this detail of age and cause. But again, I'll show you when we get to external causes, we don't even have Q3 for that. And we don't have it for all of these causes. And in any case, yes, you see the age structure of death by heart disease. I want you to just pay attention to these vertical scales of deaths per 100,000. Because, when you see 6,000 here, so 6,000 per 100,000, that's telling you 6% for 85 plus years in 1999. 6% of those 85 and older died from heart disease over that year. That's a high. Anything once you're getting into whole percents is a high rate of mortality, just in recent years. But you see it went down from 6% per year down to 4% per year. And that's a really great improvement. So over 20 years, we're seeing that most of the improvement, so you can see most of the improvement was from 1999 till about 2010, 2011, and it's been kind of flat since then. Part of that could be a lot of the improvement in the earlier years was because of reduced smoking. Could be. But we're seeing similar patterns for younger age groups, 75 to 84, coming down and then flat. Then for each of these causes, in this case, they have 3 quarters of data. And in these shaded columns, you're actually going to see the rate quarter to quarter. Kind of hard to eyeball, how these are. So the numbers are in a table below, and you can do direct comparisons of how it's changed quarter to quarter. But we're seeing in general for 45 to 54, there was an increase. So I'm just eyeballing it, and we're seeing increases for all these age groups. And we would know this. You see this bolded gray line here, that's the 0. This is like a double axis graph. So the death rates on the right side, and then the percentage quarter over quarter change is on the left side. So if it's below this gray line, it's negative, that meant it went down. And we're seeing that in Q1. So, 2020 Q1 versus 2019 Q4. Okay. But we were seeing increases in Q2 and Q3. We'll want to know more about that. Again, are they not being treated? The next cause I want to look at is Alzheimer's disease. And, okay, let me just talk about the long-term trend to begin with, and then we'll talk about the 2020 trend. We have known that, first off, obviously, most of the Alzheimer's cause of death is for the oldest age group. And you'll notice, as with heart disease, they started at the age 45. For this to even kind of get plotted, they started at age 55. And there's early onset Alzheimer's. I've unfortunately met some people who had early onset Alzheimer's. Anyway, so we have this 85 plus year group, and it's been going up. So this is one of the causes of death that's had a bad historical trend, but it may be due to the good historical trends in heart disease and cancer. Basically, and when you see dementia incidence rates, if heart disease or something's going to kill you, they're not allowed to put old age as your cause of death on your death certificate. So if treatment improvements or just risk factors have dropped so much that fewer and fewer people are dying from heart disease and cancer, well, guess what? You're more likely to live long enough to have Alzheimer's disease or another age-related dementia. In any case, you can see there was an increase, and it was flat for a while, and then another increase. Some of this can also be due to the composition of the age 85 plus group. Those age 85 in 1999, there were fewer people over the age of 100 back then compared to in 2014. This is definitely a trend we really want to investigate more. So there was this kind of steep increase here, 2013 to 2015. And again, it kind of leveled off 2015 to 2019, but we saw this steady increase in 2020. We're seeing increases in these other ones, but their rates are so far lower. And again, the 1,000 level, that's 1%. So starting in 2015, more at a rate of more than 1% per year, this oldest age group, 85 plus, were dying from Alzheimer's. Okay, so if we look at this quarter over quarter graph, this can be, again, a little confusing. The rates of death, for 55 to 64, 65 to 74, and 75 to 84 is kind of getting into the respectable range where you want to pay attention, but it's really the oldest age group that we care about. Those are the ones that have substantial death rates from Alzheimer's, and we're seeing that increase in Q2 and Q3 for them. We are seeing across the board at the older age groups, both Q2 and Q3, and we're seeing there was an increase in Q1 too. That as well, I should say, so we don't confuse the homophones there. In any case, this is a bad trend in 2020, and I don't know if we'll find out, what the driver there was. Let me try one more that it's like diabetes. Okay, so here's another one. We have a good overall historical trend. Death due to diabetes has been coming down. It's been kind of level, and yes, more people have diabetes, but the treatments are getting better, and with some of the technology we have, it's easier to control diabetes. I have both type 1 and type 2, not me, but my extended family has people both with type 1 and type 2 diabetes, not at the same time, different people. So I'm very well aware of how diabetes treatments have changed and kind of how much it can impact your life. the person I was named after died due to not directly from diabetes, but from just the years of, and needing to do treatments. That was type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disease, more severe in any case. So we saw in 2020 this very concerning increase in diabetes death rates. We're seeing rates that are putting us back over a decade in some of the cases, or even longer for younger age groups. So, what is going on here now? You'll see these death rates are much lower than what I was pointing out for Alzheimer's disease. Okay, fine. Even at the 85 plus. So these are lower rates in general, and we're trying to have the same vertical scale so you can compare between causes more easily. But we're seeing that Q2 and Q3 increase. What's going on here with regards to diabetes? Were people not getting treated who needed treatment, and that boosted the death rate? Is that what was happening? I don't know. Unfortunately, for the external causes of death, we have those numbers only through Q2. And we have three major categories: accidents, suicide, and assault. So suicide is self-explanatory. Assault, that's primarily homicide. Accidents, though, is a huge category. And it includes not only things that make you think of accidents, such as car crashes and drowning, say, or hit by lightning. That's an infrequent cause of death. But also drug overdoses are a huge component of this category. And for the oldest age groups, falls. And it doesn't even, they can just be standing there and fall. And that is going to be an accidental death. It's not necessarily external. Okay. I have always told a lot of people that if you have, for older relatives, that they fall and seriously hurt themselves, is a really bad mortality indicator. And I have told people, if you have, like, say, a grandparent, an aunt, uncle, whatever, who has fallen and broken a hip, and that could also be they broke a hip, or their hip broke because of osteoporosis, and then they fell. That's a pretty good indicator of very high mortality risk over the next year, and you should really visit them ASAP. Doesn't mean they're going to die right away. No, it's just an indication of systemic frailty, and that's kind of with regards to that very nice Gompertz-Makeham law. It's really a frailty model, and it's an indicator of frailty. So just an FYI. For younger ages, that's not necessarily true. So in any case, accidents is huge. Let me look at suicide first, and then we'll look at accidents. So if we look at the rates for suicide, and again, I want you to look at this vertical scale. This vertical scale is much skinnier than the other ones we were looking at. It doesn't even start at 0. It starts at 7, and it goes it really just goes to 21, because it is hard to distinguish between these different age groups for suicide rates. Now, if this was split out by sex, you would really see different patterns, and that's partly why this is a mess, because for males, suicide rates generally increase with increasing age. So the highest suicide rates is for men age 85 plus. But for women, it peaks in middle age and then comes down at older ages. So, this is just something to know. And that's why you see this blue line here, that's 45 to 54. A lot of that trend of that increase is being driven by women in that age group having suicide rates go up more than the male. But in general, we've been seeing a bad trend with suicide in terms of rates increasing. That's just not good. Now, the headline one that people mostly pay attention to is the 15 to 24-year-old, and you'll see that's the lowest rates, and that's true male and female. But of course, because they have, you know, because they're so young, because basically if you think of years lost due to early death, that's why it's most shocking, and that's why. And I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on that age range, but if we actually look at the suicide rates, it's higher ages that have the higher incidence, especially 85 plus. So we heard that suicides were going down or went down in 2020, and we see that for a lot of the younger age groups. But look, 85, it went up. And again, this is hard to see. Um, you can't even see the rates. This is one of the things, and this is why I like that they have the same vertical scale for this graph for each of the causes of death. You can kind of tell, you can barely see it. Compared to stuff like heart disease, etc., you know, this is, and cancer, this is not a major cause of death. It is a major cause for certain age groups, but not for the population overall. So if we look at the quarter over quarter, we will see that there was an increase for the 85 plus in Q2, and there was a decrease for the other ones in Q2. And people have theories about this. I'm just kind of reserving judgment. I don't know with regards to suicide. It's difficult to interpret. I only really have one quarter, and that's Q2, because Q1 is basically nothing with regards to COVID. You did have some lockdown policies starting in March in some places, especially up here in the Northeast, but in a lot of other places they didn't. So Q2 was kind of the first real test, but even then, people like, oh, shared sense of purpose. Well, maybe in Q2, but what about Q3 and Q4? I don't know. And we may find, what are the rate changes? But again, these rates are very small compared to the top causes of death, like heart disease and cancer. So next I want to look at accidents, and this is why, and you'll see there's two graphs here. And let me explain why. It's because in the second graph, they removed the 25 to 84 and the 85 plus, because these are much higher. And I am telling you right now, again, I'm going to remind you, accidents, they're not just car crashes, they're also drug overdoses. That's not what's killing the 85 plus. And falls. Falls is a huge component of the accidental death rate for those over 85. Same for 75 to 84. So if we remove those, let's take a look at the younger ages. And here we go. So 65 to 74, kind of flat, and then started increasing around 2014 for 15 to 24. So let me go to the other end of the ages. Was kind of flat, then dropped for a while, went up a little bit and went down, and then we saw that increasing in 2020. Again, we only have 2 quarters worth of data for that. And then for the in-between, 25 to 64, that's been generally increasing. It really took off around 2015. This is driven by drug overdoses. And we are seeing some really large increases in 2020. If we look at the 2 quarters of data that we have, on that vertical scale, you'll see the oldest ages are visible, at least. But again, remember, that's mainly falls. And then we have the 0 line, which is this for change quarter over quarter. And we'll see for those 2 oldest age groups, accidental deaths actually went down in Q2. But for all the other age groups, it went up in Q2. So what was going on? And that's especially, we'll see in our 15 to 24, 25 to 34, and 35 to 44. If we look at these percentage changes, it's these younger adults that we see huge changes. But we're also seeing there were increases that prior quarter. Again, I need to check out seasonality. Do we usually have more Q1 accidents compared to Q4? And that may be the case. I am not sure. I'll have to take a look at that. But this is a really disturbing pattern. And what was it for those younger? Was it drug overdoses? We do know car crashes were up in number, and in rate in 2020. And that was an estimate for the full year. This is only through half of the year. We will be updating these things as we get more data from the CDC, and I don't want to end on this worst of the trends that I'm looking at for non-COVID cases. So let's end with a happy one. So this happy one I'm ending on is cancer. And I'm like, what's happy about that? Well, what's happy about that is the death rates for cancer have been pretty steadily improving over the last 20 years, and it continued to improve in 2020. And we have that through Q3. So let me just look at this quarter over quarter. Again, it's kind of hard to see that gray line, and you can't really eyeball the particular rates. So these are substantial rates. Again, remember, these are all on the same vertical scale. And, topping out at 4,000. And, if we look at the actual numbers, it's negative for Q1, Q2, Q3. Cancer deaths continue to improve in 2020. And it's not anything special about 2020 per se. They were improving before. And so, yay, the good mortality trend, yay, continued in 2020. So, to the extent cancer deaths have been decreasing due to improved treatment, but also due to reduced risk factors. Fewer people smoke now, for example. It continues. So not all of the mortality trends were disrupted in 2020. There are some very disturbing ones from 2020. Again, not COVID. And it's hard to tell. We want the breakdown by cause of death, by age group at the very least. We don't have that for the full year yet. And what we would really like to see is, of course, by state and county, so that we can see, were there certain policies, or was the economic hit, or whatever? Do we see differences from these external causes? Were drug overdoses worse in some parts of the country than others? For suicides, while suicides overall may be down, that may be driven mostly by oldest age groups, maybe, or, it's like what age groups drove that, because it may be suicide rates are up for some groups and down for other groups. We don't have that level of detail yet. We usually don't at this. It usually takes, I shouldn't say a full year, but it can take up to a year to get good, clean data to be able to do this kind of analysis. So we'll be updating. The Society of Actuaries has been on the ball with this, so I'll be sure to cover it when further updates come out. So keeping an eye on all the mortality trends, and talk to you later.